There is a legend among the Yakut people of eastern Siberia. It says that cranes are not just birds, but warriors who have died valiantly in battle and return to life as majestic white cranes. Wherever mankind has come in contact with cranes, we revere them as symbols of loyalty, longevity, vigilance, purity, wisdom, and good fortune. Environmentalist Aldo Leopold spoke with an ancient and timeless voice when he called the crane no mere bird. But as much as we've revered the cranes, we have not always treated them with reverence. Of the world's 15 species of cranes, 11 species face threats of extinction. Through our carelessness and neglect, we risk making ghosts of all of them. But humans have the capacity to change, and today conservationists and biologists around the world are working to protect the cranes and to preserve the precious wetlands that provide habitat for so many species. The International Crane Foundation was established in 1973 by George Archibald and Ron Sawi, fellow graduate students at Cornell University.
Ron's parents leased us their farm near Baraboo for $1 a year. So we modified that place to become a breeding center for cranes in captivity. At that time, Russia and China, which have most of the endangered cranes, were completely closed to America. And there were only a few old birds of these different species in captivity in zoos. So we brought them together in Baraboo at the Sawi farm, and we're very successful in breeding them.
ICF quickly outgrew its first home and moved to its current quarters near Baraboo, Wisconsin in 1983. Its early focus was on captive breeding and field research. Archibald traveled to Japan, Korea, and Iran. Sawi studied cranes in India. ICF successfully bred all 15 species of cranes at Baraboo. With a large population of cranes now in zoos worldwide, they are concentrating on breeding whooping cranes for release into the wild. Today, ICF has a staff of about 48 people and offices in China, India, Russia, South Africa, and Vietnam.
And we have a world working group of some 800 people that are involved in studying and helping cranes. All of the species of cranes are now very well established in captivity with sound genetic management at many centers around the world. And our efforts are now working with local people and governments to save the last habitats of the cranes.
The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service established its whooping crane recovery program in 1967 at the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. It involved 3 concurrent approaches. The first approach was to study the birds in the wild, to understand their basic behaviors, their habitat, their reproductive cycles, what it would take for them to survive. The second approach was to study them in captivity with the aim of establishing a captive breeding program. And the third approach was to develop the tools and the techniques for rearing the chicks in captivity, imprinting them on adult cranes, and releasing them successfully into the wild.
This is cutting-edge conservation. It requires time and money, patience and persistence, and intense dedication. It involves the contributions of hundreds of highly dedicated biologists, conservationists, administrators, benefactors, organizations, and volunteers. One biologist has called it the wildlife conservation equivalent of putting a man on the moon. Cranes that are reared in captivity are ill-equipped for survival outside their pens. But captive birds alone cannot save a species. Raising chicks to succeed in the wild was one of the challenges of saving the whoopers from extinction. In 1982, while Archibald was dancing with Tex, his wife Kyoko was studying sandhill cranes at the Aldo Leopold Memorial Reserve near Baraboo.
Upon my advice, she put her blind too close to the nest and they abandoned. So she kept the eggs warm all night in her ski jacket.
The adult cranes never returned, and the Wisconsin DNR gave the ICF permission to incubate the eggs and raise the chicks. In a farmhouse near the Leopold Reserve, they raised the chicks in isolation from humans. A puppet that Kyoko created stood in for the chicks' parents when needed.
And in the autumn, when they could fly, they joined the wild cranes and disappeared. They were very afraid of humans.
Both cranes survived for many years in the wild.
Those were the first cranes that were reared in captivity using this isolation rearing technique that was subsequently improved upon by Rob Horwich and by Richard Urbanek using sandhill cranes here in Wisconsin. The birds were isolation reared, released with wild cranes, migrated to Florida, came back, successfully nested.
Kyoko's puppet and the survival of the two orphaned sandhill cranes pointed the way toward more elaborate tools and techniques. Methods that made it possible to raise whooper chicks in isolation from humans, teach them to migrate, and release them successfully into the wild. Perhaps the greatest challenge for the recovery team was the question of migration. Some birds are hardwired for migration. They know instinctively when to go, where to go, and how to get there. Cranes, like many other large birds, have an instinctive urge to migrate, but they learn when, where, and how from their parents. The recovery team wanted to create new flocks of whoopers migrating in new ranges. But with no cranes to lead them, how would a new flock find its way?
Well, I guess it all started back in, before 1988. My ex-partner, Bill Lishman, was the first person to actually fly with birds. And I'm not sure he knew what he was getting into when he started, but it was a novel idea and he thought he'd try it. And it took him a number of years, and I think he crashed up a number of airplanes. But in 1988, he was able to successfully fly with a small flock of Canada geese. He produced a little video called "Come On Geese," which is something you say a lot when you're working with birds, you know, "Come on geese, come on geese." I believe that it drew the attention of Terry Kohler. And Terry took that video and showed it to George Archibald, who is, of course, the founder of the International Crane Foundation. And that kind of alerted the scientific community to a possible method of teaching migrations to precocial birds.
I was not aware of Bill Lishman's work back in the 1990s with Canada geese. And one day Terry Kohler gave me this little film called "Come On Geese." I brought this video to the Whooping Crane recovery team. There are 10 of us on this team. We meet once a year. And they all thought, oh, here comes George again with a silly idea. But it wasn't so silly.
So Bill asked if I was interested in helping with a migration of Canada geese, because they're precocial birds, they're colonial birds, and there's lots of them, and imprinting them wasn't a big issue. So we tried, and I took a sabbatical from my photography studio, and I had some ambition, you know, to fly with the birds 3 or 4 days a week, and then maybe work a couple of days a week to make some money, and eventually, you know, have some time off. And that was a ridiculous plan. We worked 17, 18 hours a day for several months to get the birds to follow us, because we were making huge mistakes. We didn't really know what we were doing. It was all groundbreaking. And we managed to get 18 birds all the way down to Virginia at Airlie Center, where Dr. Bill Sladen is. And 16 of those birds survived the winter, and 13 of those birds came back the following spring, right back to Ontario. In fact, 2 of them walked into the barn where the incubators were. So it really showed that this works. You can actually teach a migration route to birds, and once it's done, once it's imparted, then it becomes part of their yearly cycle. We formed Operation Migration as a Canadian registered nonprofit in 1994. That was the year after our first migration, and thereafter was a whole series of studies with multiple bird species.
Among project volunteers, stopover hosts play a special role.
Don't forget, we're the guests of some generous landowner who's allowed us to come there, you know, and I can't tell you, what that means to us. These people, I mean, they dedicate their lives to this for at least a week, you know. We have no idea when we're going to arrive, but it's going to be very early in the morning. And once we're there, we're going to fill your property up with motorhomes and airplanes, and we're going to tap into all your electricity and all your water, and we're probably going to use your showers and your internet connection, and we have no idea when we're going to leave. And that area that you own down there where the birds are, you can't go down there anymore. So, but people just invite us into their homes. They're just tremendously generous.
We landed out one day. We didn't quite make it to the destination. And we actually landed on the property of a poultry farmer. And it just so happened that he had been following along on our website. So as soon as our guys knocked on the door and started explaining, he said, yeah, I've been following your website. I know exactly what you're talking about. Come on in. By the way, I'm leaving for the weekend, but here are the keys to the house.
Richard Van Hoevelen, one of our pilots, and Dan Sprague from Patuxent Wildlife Research Center tell a really funny story of, we were down in Florida looking for a new site because the next site was like 60 miles away and we kept having bad weather, so let's go find a site that was only 20 miles away. So they're driving around the countryside and they see a field that looks, potentially good, so they find a driveway and drive up and walk up to the house, and there's a gentleman in the front. He's got his rocking chair and his shotgun and his dog and his newspaper, and he's sitting there, and they go into their story, we're from Operation Migration, we're flying birds with ultralights, on and on and on. And he kind of looks over his paper and he says, "This you boys?" And we were right in the front cover of the paper. So he loved it and thought it was great, and threw in the pickup truck and drove around and found the neighbors and got permission to use the property, and we actually flew in there the next day, so it worked really well. That's the kind of support we get. People are just very supportive, of the team and of the birds.
For biologist Kent Clegg, who led the first ultralight crane migrations, the whooping crane reminds us of our place in the world. Naturalist John Muir wrote, "Tug on anything at all, and you'll find it connected to everything else in the universe." The success of whooping crane recovery efforts is an icon of faith. It demonstrates to us that we humans are intelligent enough to recognize the mistakes we have made in tending this garden of ours. And it gives us hope that maybe, just maybe, we have the capacity and the will to make things right.
It's an opportunity to help save the species. It's not just research. All the research has been done by places like Patuxent and ICF. I'm not a researcher, I'm not a scientist, but you have to do it. You have no choice. Crane-like birds evolved just after the dinosaurs disappeared, and it's because of us that they're endangered. And so you don't have much choice. What we're doing to this earth affects all of us, and that's the message. When you talk about something in those great numbers and value, you don't have any choice. What are you going to do, go home?
Humans have honored and celebrated cranes from the beginning of time. Today, we celebrate the whooping crane's survival. Today, their haunting calls are heard in places from which they had long ago fallen silent. And this timeless, magnificent bird has come back from the precipice of extinction to grace our skies again.